So, how might science and theology enter into a discussion and perhaps be viewed as complementary rather than in conflict? Many atheist, materialist scientists would argue that there is no place for theology or religion within scientific discussion. But there are categories within various schools of theology that would say otherwise, including various theologians, both past and present, that would say no, science, religions, and theology are not in conflict, and that they would, as I would agree, that is a false dichotomy perpetuated by those who embrace what's called scientism. So I want to start by defining some terms and making some distinctions, and these three terms have very small differences, but yet they're very similar in their line of thinking. And that thinking is that science and theology have a lot to say to one another. That is, if we listen to that dialogue and don't simply just dismiss it, as many do or have. So the first term is a subcategory within theology. It's called Evolutionary Creation, taken from the definition of the term from the BioLogos website. It says, evolutionary creation is a Christian position on origins. It takes the Bible seriously as the inspired and authoritative Word of God, and it takes science seriously as a way of understanding the world God has made. Evolutionary creation includes two basic ideas. First, that God created all things, including human beings, in His own image. Second, that evolution is the best scientific explanation we currently have for the diversity and similarities of all life on Earth. And along similar lines of thinking is natural theology, defined in Wikipedia. Once termed physiotheology, is a type of theology that seeks to provide arguments for the existence of a deity based on reason and ordinary experience of nature. So natural theology could intersect very much with the previous one mentioned, as well as philosophical theology. They would all have a discussion on what natural theology would be. So this distinguishes it from revealed theology, which is based on scripture and or religious experiences. Also from transcendental theology, which is based on a priori of reasoning. It is thus a type of philosophy with the aim of explaining the nature of the gods or God, or of one supreme God or supreme being, as explained within the monotheistic traditions. This principally involves arguments about the attributes or non-attributes of a deity, and especially the deity's existence, using arguments that do not necessarily involve recourse to revelation, as would a strict biblical theology. The ideals of natural theology can be traced back to the Old Testament and Greek philosophy. Most Christian theology has Greek philosophical influences, whether we realize it or not. Early sources evident of these ideals came from Jeremiah and the Wisdom of Solomon, 50 BC, and Plato's dialogue, Timaeus, around 360 BC. Marcus Terentius Varito, 116 to 27 BCE, established a distinction between political theology, the social functions of religion, natural theology, and mythical theology. His terminology became part of the Stoic tradition, philosophically, and then Christianity through Augustine of Hippo and, of course, Thomas Aquinas. Another term to familiarize ourselves with is theistic evolution, which is primarily the main discussion of today's post. Theistic evolution, also known as Theistic Evolutionism or God-guided evolution, is a general term comprising views that regard religious teachings about God as compatible with modern scientific understanding about biological evolution, as in Darwinian evolution. Although I would say Darwinian evolution has fallen short on many points. As we progress in the discussion, we'll see why. Theistic evolution is not in itself a scientific theory, but a range of views about how the science of general evolution relates to religious beliefs or emergences, in contrast to special creation views like creation science, etc., which for the most part rejects evolutionary ideas. Theistic evolutionists accept the scientific consensus on the age of the Earth, that is in the billions of years range, approximately 13 billion years, the age of the universe, the Big Bang, and the origin of the solar system, the origin of life, and evolution, or the process of evolution. Supporters of theistic evolution generally attempt to harmonize evolutionary thought with belief in God, rejecting the conflict thesis regarding the relationship between religion and science, although most of this conflict thesis has derived from the science side. They hold that religious teachings about creation and scientific theories of evolution need not contradict each other, which brings us to the subject and the theology spotlight that we're revealing in this post concerning Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, 1881 to 1955. And here is a brief reading of the source document from Dr. Robert F. Schrödinger, who writes in Evolution News about Teilhard de Chardin, or Chardin, and the incomplete nature of evolutionary theory. Teilhard's theory of evolution differed from Darwin's in various ways. Editor's note: Dr. Schrödinger is a professor of religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. He is the author of a recent book critiquing Darwinian triumphalism, the mystery of evolutionary mechanisms, Darwinian biology's grand narrative of triumph, and the subversion of religion. Why should advocates of intelligent design care about a French Jesuit priest who died more than 60 years ago? Pierre de Chardin, along with being a Jesuit priest, was also a geologist and paleontologist. He made several trips to China to participate in geological and paleontological work. He was part of the team that discovered the Piltdown Man, later revealed to be a hoax. But Teilhard is best known for his book The Phenomenon of Man, published in French in the 1930s, prior to Darwinian's release of his Origin of Species, or around the era in which it was produced. The Phenomenon of Man was published in English in 1955. In this book, Teilhard lays out a vision for the evolutionary process. And with that said, I would say that a lot of his thinking is definitely aligned with a process, philosophical and theological perspective. Evolutionary process that is at odds with the established scientific view, but is consistent with his own religious convictions. So the established view was Darwin in the making, his Origin of Species. A truncated view. Teilhard argued that the science of his time had a truncated view of evolution, or partial. Scientists studied the evolutionary process as if it were a movie playing on a screen in front of them, with the scientists themselves as mere passive observers. Teilhard thought that evolution needed to be viewed from the inside, viewing humans not only as observers of evolution, but also as participants, or as its products. As such, Teilhard conceived evolution as occurring on 4 levels, only 2 of which were acknowledged by establishment scientists. In other words, the biological for the most part. The first of these levels he called cosmogenesis, the evolution of the physical universe. The second level he labeled biogenesis, the evolution of life in the physical universe. According to Teilhard, this is where evolutionary biologists had traditionally stopped, more than likely because of their unbelief in God. But a full accounting of the evolutionary process, he believed, required 2 additional levels. Psychogenesis, the evolution of consciousness in biological organisms, and noogenesis, or what he reflected as the evolution of reflective thought, a characteristic unique to humans. Reflective awareness and consciousness, or self-awareness. With the evolution of humans, Teilhard believed evolution had crossed what he called a threshold of reflection that would fundamentally alter the very course of evolution. Rather than a billion-fold trial and error, evolution would now proceed more intentionally through the exercise of the human mind. We should remember that Teilhard formulated these ideas in the 1930s, long before anyone had conceived of the possibility of genetic engineering. Teilhard was prescient. His most controversial idea, having fully accounted for the evolutionary process, Teilhard went on to articulate his most controversial idea. He argued that over time, human minds would eventually form a web of reflective consciousness enveloping the earth. What would he think of the internet? He called this the noosphere, In time, the noosphere would reach an omega point where consciousness would completely fuse with the God who created it. Teilhard's view of evolution was thus highly teleological. The evolutionary process existed for the purpose of creating beings with the ability of reflective thought so that they could commune with their creator. No Darwinian contingency there. Not surprisingly, most Darwinians, atheists, and materialist scientists howled with derision at Teilhard. In the response to the phenomenon of man, Nobel laureate Peter Medawar published one of the most devastating book reviews ever written. Medawar called Teilhard's book nonsense, tricked out with a variety of metaphysical conceits, and its author can be excused of dishonesty only on the grounds that before deceiving others he has taken great pains to deceive himself, unquote. For Medawar, reading Phenomenon of Man brought on feelings of real distress, even despair. Despite this, many philosophers and theologians found Teilhard's book of great interest, as do many today. But according to arch-Darwinian Daniel Dennett, the esteem with which non-scientists held the book is nothing more than a testimony to their depth of loathing of Darwin's dangerous idea, a loathing so great that it will excuse any illogicality and tolerate any opacity in what purports to be an argument. The Darwinian reaction to Teilhard's explicit evolutionary theology is of course to be expected, and many react even today, or in this way, or even worse, not willing to accept a view other than, of course, their own. What we don't expect is to find that this disdain was not shared universally with the Darwinian establishment. In this particular audio thesis, I'm highlighting an intriguing yet very controversial thinker, Teilhard de Chardin, with 3 book recommendations which fully encapsulate his overall vision, as well as bringing forth the idea that scientific theory, religious ideas, and theological discourse are not in conflict in most cases, nor are always contradictory. There are indeed formulations and ways that they can be in harmonization. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit paleontologist who worked to understand evolution and faith. He did not discard his faith in light of evolutionary discoveries. He attempted, in his thinking, to harmonize them. And in his writings, many have been inspired and thought that he has done a fairly good job at doing so. Born on May 1st, 1881, died on April 10th, 1955. Between these days, Teilhard fully participated in a life that included priesthood, living and working in the front lines of war, field work exploring the early origins of the human race. He was alive during both world wars, and adventurous travels of discovery in the backlands of China. Teilhard also participated fully in an intellectual life through the development of his imaginative, mystical writings on the evolutionary nature of the world and the cosmos. He took evolutionary theory into the realm of a participatory cosmic evolution, or universal evolution. Teilhard suffered from the rejection of his writings during his lifetime by ecclesiastical authorities and scientists alike, who were not willing to step into the middle to harmonize theology with science. They seemed to be initially at odds. In his thinking and writing, he studied the intimate relationship between the evolutionary development of the material and the spiritual world, and perhaps observed within his mystical experiences how these two apparent separate worlds interacted with each other, leading him to celebrate the sacredness of matter infused with the divine presence. In the midst of the trying times in which he lived, he continued to develop his positive vision by writing some of his most important works: The Divine Milieu, 1927, The Vision of the Past, 1935, Building the Earth, 1937, The Phenomena of Man, 1940, and The Future of Man, 1941. Teilhard's efforts to receive ecclesiastical approval for the publication of The Phenomena of Man failed, and he was also denied the opportunity to teach in France. With his health failing, Teilhard traveled to South America and South Africa, tracing further discoveries of the evolutionary journey. He finally settled in St. Ignatius Parish in New York City, where he died peacefully on Easter Sunday, coincidentally, on April 10th, 1955. Author Jim Campbell. Source: Ignatian Spirituality. Notes on Pierre de Chardin, 1881 to 1955. In moving beyond mere biological evolutionary theory, which dominated Darwin's ideas, Teilhard's understanding differs. According to him, evolution has a direction, a God-given direction, and the process was not merely random natural selection and mutations. His vision was cosmic, and his work, he proposed that humanity was evolving spiritually, cosmically, as well as the universe itself, toward what he called an omega point. Definition of omega point as a supposed future, or in this sense, eschatology, when everything in the universe spirals toward a final point of unification. He argues that the Christian Logos, namely Christ, who draws all things into himself, who, in the words of the Nicene Creed, is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, and through him all things were made. In alignment with the Apocalypse of John, that is, the Revelation, Christ describes himself thrice as the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. The idea of omega point is also developed in other writings by various individuals, such as John David Garcia, 1971, Paolo Cerulli, 1981, Frank Tipler, 1994, and David Deutsch, 1997. Now I would like to mention the Center for Christogenesis, formerly known as the Omega Center. is primarily basing its worldview upon a Teilhardian metaphysics and teleology and ontology. So the founder is Ilya Delio-Osif. Ilya is a scientist, mystic, teacher, writer, and most importantly, a person with a prophetic voice. Formerly Omega Center, her platform for introducing the world to the vision of Teilhard de Chardin. What makes her work different is she and her team focuses on teaching Teilhard as a person in the 21st century. Think of the center's work, which has a new identity, the Center for Christogenesis, as the place that picks up where Teilhard left off. In other words, a carry over of Teilhard's most famous works. The center's work is about reclaiming the future of Christianity through the understanding of the evolution of the universe and how God is significantly innate or intimate in the process. We learn more about how cosmic, human, and the world of autonomous technology evolve in a collaborative manner of consciousness as we humans meet the living God. The Center is a spiritual organization that serves an axial role in our time, bridging faith, science, culture, and community. The Center builds on the ideas of Teilhard and seeks to actualize his vision of emerging wholeness for a new vitality of the spirit. The founder offers an exploration of the divine as an awareness of God's loving, dynamic presence. This is a holistic vision integrating spirituality, science, and contemplation, and open to all faith traditions. We seek to extend this vision, that is, the faith statement of the Center for Christogenesis, to all those looking for an innovative spiritual life in a renewed role of religion or religions in the 21st century. A large contributor to the work of this Center for Christogenesis is author Peter B. Todd. Todd, born 1944 to 2020, was a research psychologist at the Neuropsychiatric Institute in Sydney, Australia, a member of the Biophysical AIDS Project at the University of California, a consultant in the Department of Immunology at St. Vincent's Hospital, and a research coordinator at the Albion Street AIDS Clinic in Sydney. His papers have appeared in the British Journal of Medical Psychology, the Griffith Review, the interdisciplinary journal Mind and Matter, Teilhardian Studies, the Journal of American Teilhard Association, and the Australian Journal of Parapsychology. His most recent book, which is the one I'm highlighting here, The Individuation of God, Integrating Science and Religion, was published in November of 2012 by Clinton Publications. He practiced as a psychoanalytic psychologist in a private practice in Sydney, Australia as well. In his recent work, B Todd argues for the integration of science and religion to form a new paradigm for the third millennium. He counters both the arguments made by fundamentalist Christians against science and the rejection of religion by the new atheists. He mentions in particular Richard Dawkins and his followers, author of The God Delusion, drawing on the work of scientists, psychologists, philosophers, and theologians. Todd challenges the materialistic reductionism of our age and offers an alternative grounded in the visionary work taking place in a wide array of disciplines. Kudos to Peter B. Todd for this masterful contribution, which will undoubtedly advance the dialogue between the scientific disciplines and theology. This particular work is paramount to this particular comparative theology work because of its assimilation or synthesis between religion and science and the concept of non-dualism and panentheism. In the Individuation of God, integrating science and religion, drawing upon the work of scientific thinkers such as Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Huxley, Pauli, Einstein, Pribram, and David Bohm on the one hand, and theologians such as Teilhard de Chardin and Hans Kung on the other, Todd asserts that Dawkins' God delusion refers to a passé, naive conception of an anthropomorphic God who created a pre-Copernican clockwork universe. By contrast, Todd points the way to a scientifically illuminated theology. He pulls from such diverse fields as neuropsychoanalysis, quantum physics, Jungian thought, and transpersonal psychology to develop a higher order of understanding of evolutionary process that embraces the complementary or terity of mind and matter and is bound by neither space nor time. It is a vision of evolution that honors consciousness, the archetypal, and the numinous as fundamental. It is difficult to do full justice to the philosophical sophistication and precision Todd brings to this subject. Readers should brace themselves for an intellectually challenging and exciting journey, foreshadowing a paradigm shift in which the conceptual boundaries between science, theology, and psyche are smashed. David Van Nuys, Ph.D., Professor, Emeritus, Sonoma State University, a host of Shrink Rap Radio podcast. Science and religion are still viewed as enemies by the popular mind, but as Peter Todd eloquently shows, the gap between them is rapidly closing. Todd writes clearly and persuasively with considerable knowledge of both camps. Carl Jung was intent on reconciling science and religion through psychology, a project which met with widespread misunderstanding. Todd throws light on this endeavor and shows us the one world that can be glimpsed beyond the separate modalities of faith and reason. The individuation of God represents a significant cultural fusion of scientific research and religious vision. David Tacey, Ph.D., author of How to Read Jung and the Edge of the Sacred, Jung, Psyche, Earth. Peter B. Todd has been a research psychologist at the Neuropsychiatric Institute in Sydney. His papers have appeared in British Journal of Medical Psychology. And a quick quote from the beginning of the preface, quote, "One common delusion about God is that the theological propositions about concepts and experiences of the numinous, or spiritual, have become meaningless and imponderable due to the lessons in how to make one's ideas clear from such logical positivists as Bertrand Russell and his pupil Ludwig Wittgenstein, and members of the once elite Vienna circle of philosophers. With this philosophical framework, the so-called God hypothesis cannot be shown to be either true or false empirically, and therefore is not to be spoken of as a meaningful scientific question. Rather, it is to be passed over in silence. However, skeptics such as biologist Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, 2006, far from considering God to be dead as a result of developments in science and philosophy, regard the existence of religion as, quote, the root of all evil, unquote. While in literature, Christopher Hitchens perceives religious belief systems to be positively toxic in his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, 2007. In reality, however, the project of Decide is far from complete, perhaps because the idea of the numinous is an integral aspect of humankind's quest for a sense of transpersonal meaning and self-transcendence from a depth psychological perspective, and in the Jungian tradition, for instance, the unconscious God archetype and numinous symbols of the self are psychic facts that require explanation rather than being simply denied or dismissed by a rationalist philosophy in which reason is dissolved by skeptical zealotry and hostility. One of the aims of this book is to address the need for a theology that may be less vulnerable to intemperate or militant criticism, and also illuminated by scientific perspectives on fundamental issues pertinent to both science and theology. For instance, the psychophysical or mind-matter problem and the understanding of the so-called arrow of time and its relationship to timelessness or eternity. In both post-quantum physics and depth psychology, these two fields have been thought to stand in a relationship of complementarity by such eminent physicists as Wolfgang Pauli and David Bohm, to whom I shall refer to at length. Richard Dawkins and his skeptical colleagues do not seem to me to have grasped how central such questions still are to Erwin Schrödinger's questions about life, mind, and matter, and to contemporary theology. Another author that has embraced the vision of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is Ursula King. In her book Spirit of Fire, The Life and Vision of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin writes of him as being a renowned French Jesuit theologian, mystic, and scientist, helped to bring Christian theology into creative dialogue with modern science and explored profound dimensions of the human condition. Beautifully written and enhanced with scores of photographs that document his dramatic life, this biography of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is wonderfully written. They document his experiences from the trenches of World War I to paleontological research in China and travels in the Gobi Desert. Spirit of Fire also explores his difficulties with church authorities, the posthumous publication of his writings, and his ongoing legacy. Ursula King, born 22 September 1938, is a German theologian and scholar of religion who specializes in gender and religion, feminist theology, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. She was a professor of theology and religious studies at the University of Bristol from 1989 to 2002, and then president of Catherine of Siena College, University of Roehampton from 2008 to 2015. She had previously been a lecturer at the Coloma College of Education, a teacher training college, at the University of Leeds. She has held multiple visiting appointments, visiting lecturer at the University of Delhi, Indian Institute of Technology, and the Indian Social Institute, by-fellow of Newham College, Cambridge, and Gonville and Calais College, Cambridge, and visiting professor at the University of Oslo, Xavier University, and the University of Louisville. In Christ in All Things, she writes, exploring spirituality with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Christ in All Things offers both a concise introduction to the spiritual vision of Teilhard and a fascinating survey of contemporary themes in spirituality through a Teilhardian lens. Though Teilhard's voice was marginalized during his lifetime, today his insights underlie many of the most important trends in contemporary spirituality. And of course, his work is being brought forward in many respects at the center of Christogenesis. Ursula King shows how Teilhard's perception of Christ in all things was the key to his holistic vision. In successive chapters, she examines how many contemporary discussions concerning the sources of Christian spirituality, the role of mysticism, interfaith dialogue, ecological concerns, and the dialogue between faith and science were indeed prefigured in his work, and to this she lays significant relevance. And here is a brief quote from the book entitled Christ in All Things, from the introduction. Quote, among the contemporary books on Christian spirituality, there has been a resurgence of interest in the French Jesuit scientists and mystic Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, 1881 to 1955. Previously, there was only occasionally a passing reference to his name or an odd page mentioning Teilhard in the context of discussing other spiritual writers, whether Thomas Merton, Bede Griffith, Charles de Foucauld, Martin Luther King Jr., or Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When still alive, Teilhard was known as an eminent scientist working on human origins in paleontology and geology. But when his religious writings were published after his death, his name became internationally known for his ideas about religion, science, and society, although these were not always well understood. However, in spite of his great reputation, it is not always clear to people how deeply Teilhard was concerned with the life and practice of spirituality in the modern world, or how passionately he was engaged in searching for a renewal of Christian life and a new understanding of holiness. Much of the neglect of his ideas was no doubt due to the widespread ignorance of his work and perhaps suppression connected with the difficulty of gaining access to his numerous writings, especially his early essays written in the trenches of the First World War. These are perhaps least known of all, but they deserve to be much more widely read, for it is in these earlier very lyrical writings with their prayerful meditations that we first discover the emergence of a powerful spiritual vision and gain insight into a spiritual practice of great depth and dedication of someone who was truly, quote, a spirit of fire. Teilhard's spirituality embraces the earth and all living forms. That would be eco-theology. It is a spirituality alight with the fire of the Spirit. There are few who write so concretely, with so much realism and evocative appeal to the senses, so much emphasis on the world, body, and matter. To him, matters. This spirituality, which is so holistic, so strong and nourishing for the body, mind, and spirit, deserves far more recognition and appreciation than it has been given so far. Ursula King writes, I invite readers of this book to explore something of the power of this spirituality by learning about Teilhard's experience and reflections about his encounter with God in our confusingly complex world, his wrestling with questions and doubts, and the strength and courage of his faith. Even in the face of persecution and rejection by his peers from both sides of the camp, science and theology, that is. Radiant with his dazzling discovery of the divine perceived as the intimately loving presence of Christ in all things. So, in summary, with the books The Individuation of God, Integrating Science and Religion by Peter B Todd, Christ in All Things, Exploring Spirituality with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and her biographical work, Spirit of Fire, The Life and Vision of Pierre de Chardin, both by Ursula King, as well as the work of the Center for Christogenesis. I'll leave a link to where you can open that and investigate further if you're curious about this particular individual. This very dynamic individual. And of course I couldn't do a comparative theology without mentioning